All right, so let's get going. This week we'll focus on the U.S. Post-Vietnam. Just to focus on the main cultural themes, how some of the stuff may have manifested itself in advertising. Thursday, we'll look at what might the future of ads be. Nobody really knows for sure. But what we do know for sure is that technology has always changed the way ads were presented to us. So we'll look at a bit of technological changes like the metaverse, things like that, that might shape the future of advertising. Today we'll discuss a bit of Woo, and then we'll finish up with Woo on Thursday. All right, so the title for this week's is Waning Faith in American Institutions, which is the government, and culture wars, which have become central to American politics today. So starting with the 70s, there's an oil crisis that continues, a real economic downturn. We talked about stagflation a bit, the OPEC oil embargo. All of this is really squeezing the American economy. This is how you may have seen, there's been trucker protests recently. Back in the 70s, there was these tractor protests similar to what's going on today. Again, there's a shortage of gas. The more expensive gas is, the more expensive your products are, like groceries, things like that. So again, just a real squeeze on the economy in the late 70s. We've looked at a lot of car ads throughout the course of the semester. Cars tended to be long, like, real status symbols. When you get these kind of cars becoming popular in the late 70s due to gas being so expensive, people are looking for cars that have better gas mileage. You have a real influx of cars from places like Japan, so you have like Nissan, Toyota, cars with better gas mileage that start to flood into the market. This puts a great strain on, Detroit, which is the normal manufacturer of American cars. So it becomes a kind of culture war rooted in the import of foreign cars, the closing of factories in the Rust Belt. You have the Camp David Accords in 1978. You have Anwar Sadat of Egypt on your left, and Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, on the right. President Carter brings them to Camp David, which is the presidential retreat. They signed this, what seems to be a historic peace agreement between what seems to be the Muslim world and Israel. Sadat is later assassinated. A lot of people aren't really happy with this peace agreement. There's a huge backlash to it. At the onset of the theocracy in Iran in the late 70s. So again, there's this real conservative resurgence all throughout the world. We'll see this in the United States in the 80s, but also in places like the Middle East, Asia. Conservatism really gains a foothold after the turmoil of the 60s and 70s. Some militia members break into the American embassy in Tehran. They take Americans hostage. This is really bad for Carter's administration. Makes it seem like it's really spiraling out of control. There's already this huge economic pressure, and then it seems that not just the Americans are being held hostage, but America is being held hostage by the Middle East in particular. There's the Mariel boat lift. In the months leading up to the election of 1980, Reagan's running against Carter. Castro just sort of empties out his prisons. They get on boats. They come to South Florida in particular. So again, this is all leading up to the election, and it's just blow after blow that Carter's taking leading up to the 80 election. He gives this speech where he seems sort of, glum on the future of American prospects. He doesn't actually say malaise in the speech, but it becomes known as the American malaise speech. And the speech that he gives becomes emblematic that the U.S. is really an empire in decline and beholden to other countries around the world, particularly Middle East oil. Reagan starts his campaign in Neshoba, Mississippi, which had been famous a few years earlier, 15 years earlier. So because this is where these civil rights activists were found murdered. They had gone down to the south, two Jewish Americans, one African American, go to Neshoba to register people to vote. They're lynched, murdered, dumped in a swamp. So it seems sort of curious that Reagan starts his campaign here in 1980. But what he's doing is he's trying to show the South that, you know, he's on their side, he's one of them. And it has a great effect. I mean, he really dominates the South. So I'll show you his 1980 election ad, one of them, which was very popular.
This is a man whose time has come, a strong leader with a proven record. In 1966, answering the call of his party, Ronald Reagan was elected governor of California. Next to president, the biggest job in the nation. What the new governor inherited was a state of crisis. California was faced with a $194 million deficit and was spending $1 million a day more than it was taking in. The state was on the brink of bankruptcy. Governor Reagan became the greatest tax reformer in the state's history. When Governor Reagan left office, the $194 million deficit had been transformed into a $550 million surplus. The San Francisco Chronicle said, Governor Reagan has saved the state from bankruptcy. The time is now for strong leadership. Reagan for president.
So Reagan runs on balancing budgets, which used to be a real central tenet of conservative politics. But he also was known as, you know, when he was a governor of California, as being a real adversary to the Black Panthers and the civil rights movement in general, which is another reason why he opens his campaign in the Deep South. And you can see he really dominates in 1980. He, you know, wins just about every state. Carter wins Georgia because Carter's from Georgia. So in Reagan's first inaugural address, he famously says, government is not the solution to your problems, government is the problem. And this signals a sea shift in American politics in which one party, the Republican Party, tries to do everything in their power to diminish the role of the federal government in public life. And this is a huge shift away from the New Deal politics of the 1930s, 40s, the post-war politics of the 50s, Great Society of the 60s. This is an attempt to take power out of the federal government and put it back into the hands of states, otherwise known as states' rights. So Reagan also becomes famous for what's known as trickle-down economics. It's this notion that if you stop taxing the richest people in the country, that those rich people will inevitably start businesses and the money will trickle down to the working classes. In practice, that's not really how it happens. Really wealthy people like to put their money into safe bets, such as real estate, the stock market, like Fortune 500 companies, things like that. They don't necessarily start businesses. So this whole notion of trickle-down economics is really a misnomer. It's misleading. It's just a way to essentially make rich people richer. So here's his 1984 campaign. But you get a sense of how sort of positive looking it is compared to the ads that we looked at in the 60s, where they're just trying to scare the hell out of you.
Real cowboys customize and save.
That's not very good.
Someone else get a turn.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. Interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980. Nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
So remember, there's this whole notion that there's a real malaise in American society in 1980, and that Reagan in 4 years has pulled America out of this malaise. The Democrats in 1984 nominated Geraldine Ferraro. She's the first female nominee for vice president. She runs with Mondale. But again, it's a real blowout, even worse than the 1980, you can see. So the US, Saddam Hussein comes to power in 1979 in Iraq. It's the head of the Ba'ath Party, as it's known. The US doesn't really love him necessarily, but they become allies with him because he's a great enemy of Iran. So Iran and Iraq get in a war together. So the US backs. So on your left is Donald Rumsfeld, who worked for Reagan, but also George W. Bush's administration, was the architect, as it were, of the Iraq invasion of 2003. There's a huge scandal in Reagan's second term called the Iran-Contra affair. The Reagan administration was secretly and without the authorization of Congress, i.e. illegally, sending arms to Iran, which was in a war with the US's ally, Iraq. With the money from Iran that the US was not supposed to have from these arms sales, they sent money to a Contras in Nicaragua who were in a war with the Sandinistas. And so the upshot of the Iran-Contra affair is that nobody was held accountable. Liberals lost faith in the government and just a general sense of fairness. And Oliver North, who testified that he had shredded evidence, was made into a cold figure by conservatives in particular. So the US has already lost a lot of, the general population of the US has lost a lot of faith in the federal government as a result of Vietnam. The Pentagon Papers coming out, people are really skeptical about the findings of the Warren Report, which came out after JFK's assassination. Then you have Watergate in the 70s, and then you have the Iran-Contra affair in the 80s. And again, this is all just like a general erosion in the belief of the federal government, of the government writ large, of American institutions, which we saw sort of like boil over in 2020. You also have the rise of neoconservatism in the 1980s. This is a political movement that was born in the 1960s among liberal hawks who became disenchanted with the increasingly pacifist foreign policy of the Democratic Party and with the growing new left and counterculture of the 60s, particularly the Vietnam protests. So the upshot of this is that Democrats leave the party, leave the Democratic Party for the Republican Party, which is increasingly aligned with militarism and Christian nationalism. What we mean when we say Christian nationalism is a Christianity-affiliated religious nationalism. Christian nationalists' primary focus is on international politics, or internal politics, I should say, such as passing laws that reflect their Christianity and its roles in political and social life, particularly anti-Roe v. Wade, particularly against gay marriage. So the separation of church and state was central to the founding of the nation in the 18th century. Christian nationalists point out that founding fathers were Christians. Meanwhile, they often ignore that most of them also owned slaves. So again, Christian nationalism becomes central to American politics in the 1980s. Jerry Falwell on your right is a direct advisor to Reagan. He's the head of what's called the moral majority. Essentially argues that AIDS is an example of the United States being punished for homosexuality and lack of morality. And this all becomes baked into conservative politics. Televangelism becomes very popular in the 1980s. People basically just sit around watching television all day, especially old people. And a lot of the programming they watch is created by Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. Of course, they ran into a really bad scandal. Jimmy Swaggart also ran into a really bad scandal, just stealing money from his church, having affairs with porn stars, things like that. Jerry Falwell is really central to this conflating of republicanism with American conservatism. And it's important to note that prior to Roe v. Wade, Christians weren't really too centrally involved in politics. They always thought of politics as just a centrally dishonest arena of American life. So they might go out and vote, but they wouldn't sort of wear their politics on their sleeves until the 1980s. Pat Robertson also argues that homosexuals are being punished with God's wrath in the form of AIDS. He becomes a very popular televangelist of the era. Billy Graham became really popular in the 1950s. We talked about him a bit earlier in the semester. He stays pretty popular through the 1980s, also an advisor of the Reagan campaign. This map shows you by the recent times, I think by 2016, if I remember correctly, this map is from. You get a sense of just how many Protestants and Catholics are in the House and the Senate. It's not necessarily that they're devout, but they have to at least give lip service to them being devout Protestants or Catholics in order to get elected in that particular district or that particular Senate arena. But it gives you a sense of just how entrenched Christianity has become at the grassroots. So I'll show you this quick few-minute video about the centrality of Christianity to American politics and why the Democrats have lost so much ground in recent years because of it.
So the fun thing with the serpent is, how does the serpent talk? And not only that, but why is the serpent's punishment?
Many religious voters feel alienated from the Democratic Party. Donald Trump overwhelmingly won Christian voters, including 81% of white evangelicals and 60% of white Catholics. The obvious reason is that Donald Trump offered these voters more of what they wanted, like overturning Roe versus Wade and appointing conservative Supreme Court justices. But there's something bigger going on. Democrats often have trouble speaking in moral or religious language, and they're part of a broader culture that doesn't take religion seriously.
Democrats don't know how to talk to a lot of these people that go to church, people of value. I mean, the Democratic Party has become a secular party.
So, is the Democratic Party really secular? To a large extent, yes. 28% of Democrats don't identify with any particular religion, compared to just 14% of Republicans. And only 1/3 of Democrats say they go to religious services at least once a week. Just 10% of Democrats weren't religious in 1996. That number has tripled over the last 2 decades, and the trend is only likely to continue as more young people join the party. Pop culture can also be pretty hostile to religion. Some comedians, journalists, and artists actively antagonize people of faith.
It worries me that people are running my country who believe in a talking snake.
You don't have to pass an IQ test to be in the Senate, though.
Partly as a response, Christians and other groups have formed their own subcultures of movies and music and news. For instance, Trump voters really love the movie God's Not Dead, which is a movie about religious liberty that a lot of progressives have probably never heard of.
Something wrong.
I can't do what you want, I'm a Christian.
You cannot bring yourself to admit that God is dead, and you will need to defend the antithesis.
Of course, a lot of Democrats are religious. Black Protestants, for example, have consistently supported the Democratic Party, even though a lot of these voters are conservative on issues like same-sex marriage and abortion. But their views aren't always reflected in the party. Roughly 1/3 of Democrats identify as pro-life, but only a handful of Democratic politicians share their views. Democratic leaders can also be uncomfortable with the language of morality and religion. Sometimes this has resulted in wipeouts that are insulting.
They get better if they come to guns or religion.
Other times, it's just embarrassing. One White House staffer recently reported that a former colleague kept deleting the phrase "the least of these" from the title of a memo, wondering whether the famous teaching from Jesus was a typo. This is a shift from the past. Progressive achievements like the civil rights movement relied heavily on religious rhetoric.
But I want you to know tonight that we as people will get to the promised land.
Leaders from Martin Luther King to Jimmy Carter framed their ideals in explicitly religious terms, and audiences were receptive to those messages. Some progressive leaders do this today. Reverend William Barber, the head of the North Carolina NAACP, has successfully led a Moral Mondays protest movement against the racist policies of the state legislature.
I'm a preacher and I'm a theologically conservative, liberal, evangelical biblicist.
You could also argue that Bernie Sanders fired up millions of young Americans with his explicitly moral language about economic inequality. But both of these men are outsiders in the Democratic Party. If Democrats really want to be the party of inclusion, it can't just be about skin tone and sexuality. It has to be about belief too. This is Unprecedented, a weekly series in which
So another way of putting it is that identity politics are central to American politics. So if you're a Christian, chances are you'll vote for the Republicans. This didn't used to be the case. Catholics, especially in the Northeast, used to be a solid voting bloc for the Democratic Party. Back when the Democratic Party was essentially the party of the working class, of the labor movement. But things have shifted over time. So what we mean by identity politics is a political approach wherein people of a particular gender, religion, race, social background, social class, environmental, or other identifying factors develop political agendas that are based upon these identities. So If you're rural, chances are you're Southern and from the West, and you'll vote for the Republican Party. If you're urban, as it's called, the Northeast, chances are you're voting Democrat. If you're white and Christian, chances are you're voting for Republicans, as opposed to if you don't necessarily think of yourself as a Christian or you think of yourself as spiritual, chances are you'll vote for the Democratic ticket. College educated people tend to vote for the Republican Party, or sorry, for the Democratic Party, versus non-college educated tend to vote conservative. And of course, the African American LGBTQ are sort of the base of the Democratic voting bloc, as opposed to Christians, who are the base of the Republican voting bloc. So I'll show you a Jeb Bush ad from 2016, in which he really tries to beat Donald Trump over the head with identity politics.
I lived in New York City and Manhattan all my life, okay? So, my views are a little bit different than if I lived in Iowa. Partial birth abortion. I'm very pro-choice. I am pro-choice in every respect and as far as it goes.
As far as single payer, it works in Canada. It works incredibly well in Scotland.
The fact is that 25% for high-income people, it should be raised substantially.
Who would you like representing the United States in a deal with Iran, with this regime?
Well, I think Hillary would do a good job. Hillary Clinton, I think, is a terrific woman. I mean, I'm a little biased because I've known her for years. Yeah, I know her very well. She's very talented. I live in New York. She lives in New York. And I've known her and her husband for years, and I really like them both a lot.
Do you identify more as a Democrat or a Republican?
Well, you'd be shocked if I said that in many cases, I probably identify more as a Democrat. Why a Republican? I have no idea. I lived in New York City and Manhattan all my life, okay? So, my views are a little bit different than if I lived in Iowa.
All right, so what were some of like the identity politics that the Bush campaign tried to paint Trump with? Where did they point out he was from? Right, so the urban north, not the south or the west. What was his stance on abortion, according to the commercial? Pro-choice, right? So again, they're really trying to paint him as a liberal in this ad. Of course, he doesn't actually believe in anything. Whatever people will vote, the most people will vote for him, that's what he pretends to believe in. So in 1989, you have the fall of the Berlin Wall, which seems like a really monumental moment in human history. You have what some scholars call the end of history. And what we mean by this is that all through the 20th century, there's this competition between capitalism and socialism, which is fueling history. But when the fall of the Berlin Wall happens, it seems like the end of history. Francis Fukuyama has this famous book called The End of History, and the Future of Man or something like that. Thomas Friedman argues that no two countries that have a McDonald's will go to war with each other. So it's this whole notion that the world will flower, it'll become much more democratic, much more capitalist. There won't be any more wars because everyone will be doing business together. China and Russia figured out that you could take the exact opposite role of this. Like, for instance, Russia knows that Europe is dependent on its oil. So it limits Europe's ability to get involved in the war in Ukraine. The NBA, for example, makes so much money televising NBA games in China that it keeps the NBA from criticizing China's slave labor practices, keeps LeBron James from criticizing China's slave labor practices. So you also have in the 1980s, the crack epidemic really hits the urban north, urban west, LA, and incarceration rates really skyrocket. You can see globally, the US becomes by far the leading incarcerator. They built a real prison industrial complex, as it came to be known. People jokingly said that Reagan's jobs program was the criminalization of poverty, where you could just basically put more people in jail. And of course, slave labor is often used in prisons in terms of like they're paying someone like 10 cents an hour to make their overalls or whatever the case may be. But on the end of the spectrum, you have McDonald's they have this famous like Calvin ad, which I'll show you. Comes out in the early 90s.
If you want to eat healthy and feel your best, you've got to try Kachava. Kachava is the world's
Hey, isn't that Calvin? I haven't seen him for a while. Wonder where he's heading. I heard he got a job. Is that right? Well, it's about time he got himself together. Now that you mention it, there is something different about him. Just goes to show you can't judge a book by its cover. Looks like responsibility's been good for him. Well, I'm just glad somebody believed in him enough to give him a chance. Wonder where he's working. Welcome to McDonald's. May I help you?
There's like an underlying racism in that commercial, I think, in terms of like,
Seems racist.
what do you think is racist about it? I'm interested.
I guess it seems racist due to like poor African American in the urban city like going to work at McDonald's like having to walk to work and like things like act so polite like saying welcome to McDonald's, can I help you? But basically he's like probably saying in his head about negative probably being racist with negative thoughts.
Yeah.
Not judging a book by its cover.
Right. Go ahead.
I think it's also just saying that like if he wasn't saved by McDonald's, it's like a white savior complex. If he wasn't saved by McDonald's, he would not have helped out women with her groceries. He would be hanging out with these kids and
But
like
the
not
loitering
having a
kids
job.
aren't going to school.
Yeah.
Perhaps it has more to do with the fact that it's playing on the teenage stereotypes of a teenager with like the backwards hat. I mean, race could be a factor, but I thought that like from hearing it, at least the women were like, they seemed like older women from like the community, like gossip types who are like, they see him on the street doing whatever with his like teenage buddies. So
Yeah, but I think the subtext of it is that like you have the loitering kids, right? Who like he doesn't stop to hang out with them. He's on his way to work, so like good black kid. And then also the notion that like this is during the time period when there's like a real sort of like crime wave as a result of the crack epidemic. Old women, at least the news is portraying these black kids to be like preying upon old people in general. So you see this old lady sort of stumbling along, and rather than preying on her, he helps her. So I think there's sort of like the subtext of it is like this whole sort of like urban crack epidemic that's happening during this time period. Mass incarceration that's happening during this time period. As Isla points out, like McDonald's is setting up shop in these urban neighborhoods and like saving these kids from the streets essentially. Never mind that they're poisoning the people who they're feeding in those communities. Let's have this really interesting Michael Jordan commercial that comes out. I'll show it to you. Or Air Jordan's commercial for the Air Jordan 1s.
On September 15th, Nike created a revolutionary new basketball shoe. On October 18th, the NBA threw them out of the game. Fortunately, the NBA can't stop you from wearing them. Air Jordans from Nike.
Yeah, so it's a super low budget commercial, just one shot going down. Of course, the NBA advanced the Jordan 1 because at the time they just had like a white, you could only wear white shoes. So Nike comes out with this and they're really at first freaked out that they're not going to be able to sell Jordans to kids because you won't be wearing them in games. So they take this negative and turn it into a positive where Jordan is depicted as this sort of like rebel figure and like the NBA is so square, but you can be cool by buying these shoes. Really, sort of like brilliant way of taking a negative and turning it into a positive. The rest, as they say, is history. So Bush, he was Reagan's vice president in the early 80s up until 89 when he becomes president. He wins by saying, promising voters no new taxes. The 1990s, the conservative spectrum of the right of American polity really shifts really hard to the right. There's all kinds of anti-crime bills that are passed. At the same time, you have gangster rap becoming very popular. A lot of scholars have noted that gangster rap of this era is very similar to the minstrel shows of the 1890s, in which you have this really caricatured, performative blackness, this hyper-violent, hyper-sexual, hyper-materialist depiction of Black performance that was very popular in minstrel shows. But at the same time, you have the antithesis of that in the commodification of Jordan, who's depicted to be sort of like a CEO type. You also have like Mortal Kombat becomes a very popular video game. Britney Spears becomes a darling of American popular culture. Grunge rock becomes very popular. You have the Gulf War in 1991, the first Gulf War. Clinton takes this whole notion of no new taxes that Bush promised his voters. He did actually raise taxes, and Clinton really bludgeons him with this. I'll show you Clinton's ad.
1988.
Read my lips.
Then George Bush signed the second biggest tax increase in American history.
Read my lips.
George Bush increased taxes on the middle class. Bush doubled the beer tax and increased the gas tax by 56%. Now George Bush wants to give a $108,000 tax break to millionaires. $108,000. Guess who's going to pay? We can't afford 4 more years.
And part of what they had to pay for was the Gulf War, which during the Gulf War, none of you were alive, I don't think, during it, but it was really popular at the time. There was like all kinds of songs that came out about it. It was like America really had like a war fever during the Gulf War. But of course they had to pay for it with this beer tax and gas tax, and 2 things you do not tax Americans without them punishing you for it is beer and gas. So in 92, this guy Ross Perot, he runs as a third-party candidate. He wins a lot of votes in the Deep South and the West, peels votes away from the Republican Party, which pushes Clinton over the edge. But in 94, in the midterms, you have what's called the Republican Revolution. The Republicans take the House and the Senate for the first time since 1952. And this really lurches the whole American political spectrum to the right. On the right, make a real hard turn, some might say, towards fascism, if you sort of, look at what the party's become now, which is sort of based on demagoguery and culture wars. But the Republicans, or the Democrats, essentially become what the Republicans were back in the 50s. They become really hard on crime. They start to really disintegrate the welfare state or social programs that have been so central to democratic politics through the post-war period. You have what's considered the rise of the age of terror in American society. In 1993, you have the first World Trade attack. They just drove some vans down inside the basement of the World Trade Center and detonated some bombs. They were hoping that that would bring it down, but it didn't, just caused a lot of damage in the basement. You have the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 caused by this guy, Timothy McVeigh. He's a Christian nationalist, white supremacist. As you can see in this picture, there was a nursery in this federal building in Oklahoma that he bombed, and a lot of dozens of little kids were killed in it. But during the same time period in the 90s, you have a really popular campaign by Nike, the Bow Nose campaign. So I'll show you what this is about.
Oh no, it's baseball. Oh, it's football. Basketball too. No.
Folks, you don't know diddly.
So who's Phil Jackson? What's he famous for? Go ahead.
Oh, he was a famous 2-sport athlete for football and baseball.
Yeah, exactly. So it used to be, if you were into basketball, you would buy basketball shoes. If you were into football, you would buy football shoes, whatever. And like Nike premieres the cross trainer for people who are into different sort of sports at the same time. So it's a real branding, ingenuity in their part. You also have the Apple. You might recall we talked about Steve Jobs was very embedded in the counterculture. And I think you see this in this ad from 97, I think, if I remember correctly, maybe 98.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them. because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
And so Steve Jobs had actually been fired by the board from Apple. And Apple falls into real disarray. It's about to go bankrupt, so they hire him back. He saves the company. And part of the way he saves the company is by really sophisticated branding, as you can see here. So the 2000s, we have what's called the rise of weapons of mass destruction. He talks a lot about these weapons of mass destruction. We'll talk about them as well. You have the dot-com bust, which starts to gain momentum in the late 90s. Basically, any company that had a .com attached to its name, there was all kinds of stock speculation that went into it. Let's see, good luck. So all kinds of speculation that went into these .com companies, essentially companies that had no business being .coms, marketed themselves as .com companies because they knew it would lead to all kinds of speculation in their company, all kinds of public money would go flooding in. And it just created this huge bubble for tech companies and just pet stores that had .com at the end of their names. Some of them survived, like Amazon survived and thrived. But most of them, as you can see from this, if you read the names here, like most of them you've never heard of. So here's the chart. You can see it really peaks like right here, right on the cusp of 1999, 2000. And then just sort of goes into oblivion. Google survived, Amazon survived. So in 2000, you have a really hotly contested election, a really controversial election. You can see Bush wins the Electoral College in controversial fashion, but Gore wins the popular vote, as did Hillary Clinton in 2016. So one of the problems with this vote was there was this butterfly ballot in places like South Florida. You have a lot of retirees in South Florida who may have just been rushing in to get their vote cast. And so the second, you can see the first one would be George Bush, but the second one, a lot of people wanted to vote for Gore and Lieberman, but ended up voting for Pat Buchanan instead. It was like a really hard, like right-winger third-party candidate. So there was a lot of problem with this ballot. As you can see, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense the way it's designed. Jeb Bush, George Bush's brother, was the governor of Florida at the time, which means he appointed the Secretary of State, the person who oversees the voting of the counts, which people thought was quite fishy. There's a Brooks Brothers riots during the recount in South Florida. All of these guys, like upper class conservatives, rushed into the voting rooms and basically forced the counters to stop voting. The Supreme Court, 5 of the 9 were appointed by Reagan or Bush. Remember, Bush was Reagan's vice president. They ultimately decided that the voting has to stop. So the winner is decided to be George W. Bush. And you can see this Newsweek article basically depicts them to be the same person. And they really sort of were. Their policies were so similar that it was like voting for like oranges or tangerines, essentially. They were both so centrist. John Paul Stevens, who was a dissenting vote, voted against the stopping of the counts. He says in a famous interview that the worst casualty of how the election of 2000 was decided is that Americans would lose faith in the institution of the Supreme Court, which has happened gradually over time. It's at its lowest levels in American history today. Everyone essentially sees the court as being very partisan. So there's this conservatism that's baked into American politics, which I think the 2000 election really dispelled. So the greatest way that conservatism is baked into the American political system is through the Electoral College. It was added to the Constitution as a compromise designed to give less populous states, i.e. slave states, equal representation with urban manufacturing centers. So masters were allowed to count their slaves as 3/5 of a human being for their own political representation. Today, there's 40 more million Democrats than Republicans in the US, but Republicans have won the presidency twice in the past 22 years without actually winning the popular vote. And there's skewed representation in federal government, particularly the Senate. For example, the population of New York and California is 36 million versus Wyoming and South Dakota, which have a combined population of 1.4 million. But they share the same number of senators, which means that the minority has more power than majority, which is antithetical to a democracy. So the minority is allowed to destroy popular legislation such as Build Back Better, action to address climate change, and they're able to pack the Supreme Court with conservative justices, which has happened in the past 20 years. So in 2000, you also have the bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen, 9/11, of course, in September 9/11. The Pentagon's also bombed, as well as the World Trade Center. One of the casualties of this is Americans had always prided their privacy, but American privacy is really under attack after the Patriot Act. You have sort of the rise of the surveillance state all through the 21st century. The U.S. invades Afghanistan in 2001, which seems to make sense. The Taliban was responsible for the attacks. They had been given safe harbor in Afghanistan. What didn't really make sense was the invasion of Iraq. The U.S. had sold the American public and the UN Security Council on the fear that that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and that they were, aiding terrorists. None of that was true. People at the time said that, we know they have weapons of mass destruction because we have the receipts. We sold them the weapons of mass destruction in the 80s when they were at war with Iran, and which was true, but who knows what happened to them in the meantime. By the time the U.S. got there, they were gone. So again, the U.S. invades Iraq in 2003, creates ISIS as a result of this. Saddam Hussein is captured in 2003 or 4, I can't remember which. He's ultimately put on trial for war crimes and hanged. Another startling event of the early 2000s was Hurricane Katrina, which was really, many years in the making. It didn't just happen in 2005. It was the process of redlining, of suburbanization, of sort of this two Americas that's created between urban or rural, suburban, rich and poor. Bush was perceived to be AWOL. He didn't go actually visit New Orleans until 3 weeks after Katrina. He did do a flyby on the way back from his vacation in Houston, but people just thought this was really crass. There's a telethon that happens. Kanye West famously says George Bush doesn't care about Black people. You can see Mike Myers over here just sort of wait, that wasn't in the script. But anyway, it had a real resonance. So another important thing that happens in the late 90s is the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act. This was passed in 1933 to separate commercial and investment banking. The Clinton campaign does away with it, which leads to the 2008 speculation. So I'll just give you a quick video. It does a better job of explaining the crisis than I would be able to.
We bundled our insurance with NJN and saved.
We bundled with the alpaca.
Did you know that you could make $20,000 in profit by putting these new Tesla solar?
From December 2007 to June 2009, the United States suffered an extended economic downturn that came to be known as the Great Recession. It was the worst financial crisis in the US since the Great Depression, leaving an impact on homes and businesses in America and around the world. We'll look at the causes of the recession itself, and its lasting impact. While failures in financial regulation and excessive borrowing by households in Wall Street contributed, the primary cause of the Great Recession was the subprime mortgage crisis. A mortgage is a loan that allows people to buy a house up front. A subprime mortgage is normally issued to borrowers with low credit ratings. And historically, many banks wouldn't even make loans to people with bad credit. In the early 2000s, however, the housing market was booming. So banks began giving subprime mortgages to people, even if they had low credit ratings. In other words, lenders, often banks, were loaning money to people who were less likely to be able to pay them back and charging them more money for those mortgage loans through high interest rates. Now, on the face of it, it doesn't sound like the best deal for the lender or the borrower. But many people took on these subprime mortgages because they stood to make a large profit if their house increased in value. And that seemed like a pretty good bet. Houses have been increasing in value over the past several years. Home ownership had always been central to the American dream, and people who may never have imagined they could own a home saw the possibility in front of them. So where did things go wrong? In 2007, the housing bubble burst. As demand went down, the prices of homes dropped rapidly. People stopped investing in real estate since it was no longer as profitable. Many people were no longer able to pay off their mortgages or sell their houses, and the banks foreclosed their homes. Since the foreclosed houses were now worth less money, financial institutions lost money too, along with the homeowners. As a result, the housing market failed, banks collapsed, the economy plummeted, and the Great Recession had officially begun. So, what did this mean for the average American? The economic downturn was devastating. Many people and businesses suffered huge financial losses and therefore spent less money, further damaging the economy. Financial firms were not as capable of lending money. And in 2008, the US government finally had to step in and bail out the banks, increasing the national deficit. During the Great Recession, more than 8 million Americans lost their jobs. Nearly 4 million homes were foreclosed each year, and 2.5 million businesses closed. Bank bailouts, federal aid to the auto industry, and government spending programs helped avoid an even bigger crisis. But it may take decades more to fully understand the significance of the Great Recession.
Yeah, so one of the upshots of the Great Recession is it's another erosion in people's belief in sort of fairness of American institutions. So I won't bog you down with all the details of this, but there's essentially, a widespread calamity for poor people, working class people, middle class people. The middle class shrinks significantly. You have bailouts of these companies that were responsible for these bad loans. They knew they were giving out bad loans. They knew they were creating a bubble, but the government bails them out. So again, this is like socialism for the top 1% and capitalism for everyone else. And it leads to a real erosion of belief in the American system, belief that the American dream is dead, which I think this video does a good job of illuminating.
Once upon a time, at the dawn of the industrial age, millions flooded our shores with a dream to enjoy political freedom and economic freedom, to live in a land with liberty and justice for all. And our government took action when Wall Street wiped out the dream. For the 30 years after the Second World War, our Uncle Sam made us a patriotic promise. If you worked hard, played by the rules, you could make a better life for your family. When workers united to win better wages and working conditions, the government told business not to interfere. When their sons returned home from war, the government gave these veterans a shot at a college degree, a good home, and their own business. All that, a good job, a good education, a nice home, plus the protection of Social Security and Medicare when they grew old. Citizen activists and active government made sure that as the country grew richer, everyone shared in our nation's prosperity. But the CEOs of big corporations and Wall Street speculators wanted more pie for themselves. Starting in the 1970s, they tied Uncle Sam's hands and rewrote all the rules. They de-taxed themselves by slashing income taxes, capital gains taxes, and the top marginal income tax rates. They deunionized their businesses by suppressing the labor movement. And they deregulated the environment and fancy financial transactions like those subprime mortgage derivatives that brought the world to the brink of economic collapse. The end result, CEOs of big corporations and Wall Street speculators kept more of the pie. The share of national income earned by the top 1% of Americans has increased from around 8% in 1974 to more than 18% in 2007. The top 0.01% of us, or 1 in 10,000 households, soared in annual income from $4 million in 1974 to $35 million on average in 2007. At the same time, workers have seen wages stagnate and even fall. We've gone from prosperity for all to the rich takes all. And why should all Americans care? The income gap between the nation's richest and poorest is the most powerful indicator of a functioning, healthy society. As income disparity spikes, so too does rates of homicide, obesity, drug use, mental illness, anxiety, teenage pregnancies, high school dropouts. You have to wonder, who will stand up to big corporate interests? Who has the power to mobilize millions? Is this the beginning or the end for the American dream? It doesn't have to be. It's time for us to unite and rebuild the American dream. All across the country, workers are demanding good jobs. Good jobs with decent wages are the backbone of our national greatness. The American dream can still be a reality, but they need you. Uncle Sam needs you.
All right, so has anyone read this book, Capital, by Thomas Piketty in the 21st century? Any economic students in here? Well, he basically sort of points out using statistics that the gap between the richer and poor is just getting wider and wider, and it doesn't matter how hard you work or how lucky you are. Rich people are going to fail forward, and no matter how hard working people work, like they're never going to sort of be anything other than middle class. And this is what we mean by the death of the American dream. This whole notion that you could work hard, you could raise a nice family with a nice house with a picket fence and all that. That dream, according to Piketty, is sort of gone by the wayside. And again, like Piketty's stats are just pointing out the gap between the rich and poor just gets more and more gaping of a chasm. So this is the building I live in over here. It's a good example of what Piketty's arguing. This is my building here. So what happens is like oligarchs essentially buy up these top floors from around the world, not just American oligarchs, but Russian oligarchs, Chinese oligarchs. And what they do is they park their money in these tens of millions of dollars apartments, penthouses, which makes the cost of real estate for all around this go up, which means working people can't live in the city anymore. They're essentially pushed out of the city. And this sort of like global phenomenon that's happening. So why do rich people like to park their money in these types of high rises? Because it's the safest bet. Real estate always goes up over the course of 10 years. It might, like in 2008, have a recession and go into decline, but over the course of 10, 20 years, it's by far the safest investment. But again, like cities like London, New York, Paris, these used to be places where working class people could raise families. They're not anymore. They basically have pushed out any type of working class people. But you have all these gig workers who come into the city. You know, their commute is basically like 2 hours into the city, 2 hours out of the city. And all of this has given rise to what we refer to as populist nationalism, which is a rejection of globalization. You see Trump, Le Pen, Bolsonaro, Viktor Orban, Brexit is a good example of Boris Johnson ran on a Brexit ticket. This whole sort of grassroots populism of wanting to sort of destroy the global economy, which of course isn't possible at this stage, and sort of make things more about nationalism. And this whole anxiety associated with the death of the American dream, you can see how companies like E-Trade are trying to capitalize on this. So there's another one.
I call it the wheel. I don't think so. What does it do? It rules. Yeah, so does a bagel, okay? A bagel you can eat.
One of the worst ideas I've ever heard.
Brother David, behold, it's a fork. I got 10 forks right here, baby. My lord? What is it? A toilet, my lord. A toilet? You expect this court to do its business inside? We're not animals. Inside like humans.
It's comfy. It's new.
It's awful.
You don't like it?
I'm all jittery and
feel like I got a big job coming up.
Hancock, you sign first. No king! Gentlemen, have you taken leave of your senses? The people shall have the right to vote. Even the stupid ones? Yes. Stupid people vote? Yes.
Edison, can I be honest with you? It stinks. Does your wife know what's going on here? She knows I go to work. You're wasting your time, and it's sad. You might as well put the dishes in the shower.
Hey, Captain, what's cooking? We're putting a man on the moon. Are you out of your mind? I can't even get tuna without celery. Nobody's going to the moon, ever. Why not? It's good fun. It's fun. It's really fun. It's fun. 我々の未来はとても見えてきです。バカか。バカか。わかるだろう。わかるだろう。わかるだろう。出て行け。今言うのか。Go right now. Go. また2回打つのやるぞ。また言うの。
Like I was saying, it's FTX. It's a safe and easy way to get into crypto.
Yeah, I don't think so. And I'm never wrong about this stuff. Never.
So one of the selling points for crypto is that, you know, you can get super rich off of crypto. Some people have, they put in, say, like $1,000 into crypto. It's gone from, you know, being worth like 2 cents to being worth, you know, during the pandemic, I think it got to like $70,000 for like one coin. It's, you know, back down to about 40 now. But the whole notion is that, you know, through these speculative devices, you can achieve the American dream. So this commercial in general is trying to sell you on FOMO. Like all of these great inventions have happened over time that have changed the world, and crypto is that too. I'm not so convinced. But you also have the gig economy rise to the fore as a result of, you know, everyone having cell phones now. This whole notion that, like, you know, you can do all these side hustles, as it's called. It's really profitable for tech companies like Uber, DoorDash, things like that, but it's really bad for the worker. The worker's unprotected. They can be fired at any moment. There's no job protection. They don't have any health benefits, things like that. So again, it's really good for the people who design the software, but really bad for the workers at the other end of it. You also have the gamification of markets. Robinhood's a good example of that. And again, it's all trying to capitalize on this anxiety associated with people knowing that, like, you know, they're leaving college with tens of thousands of dollars in you know, compound interest debt. It's harder to get jobs. It's harder to attain the American dream. So all of this stuff is really trying to capitalize on that. DraftKings has become really popular recently. This is a good example of how the social contract has changed over time. It used to be that the government would protect you from, you know, gambling rings like the mafia. And now lobbyists have become so powerful in American politics that even sort of like the mob has gone legit in the form of DraftKings, essentially. And of course, the 20th century, 21st century, I should say, is American politics is defined by culture wars. So the definition of culture war is a commonly used term to describe aspects of contemporary politics in the US. In American usage, culture war may imply a conflict between those values considered traditionalist or conservative and those considered progressive or liberal. So there's a long history of culture wars in American society. Really took root in the 1920s, coincided with several decades of immigration to the US by people who earlier European immigrants considered alien, such as Asians, Jews, Southern and Eastern Europeans. The cultural shifts and modernizing trends of the Roaring '20s also fueled the culture wars. The Scopes monkey trial is a good example of the culture war in which you have science pitted against religion. You still see this pitting of science, you know, this sort of distrust of experts such as Fauci. You saw this during the pandemic. Fauci's whole purpose was to, like, try to save as many lives as possible and end the pandemic, as opposed to, like, the pro-business part of American society, like Donald Trump, who, you know, he saw the pandemic as an affront to his chances to get reelected and hurting the stock market, things like that. So the culture was changed over time to, like, science and religion to, like, science and the market. So society increasingly divided into two warring groups from 1991 to 2001, defined primarily not by nominal religion, ethnicity, social class, or even political affiliation, but rather by ideological worldviews, particularly progressivism versus orthodoxy. At the end of the Cold War, you see the sort of change in the culture wars in American society in 1991. Evangelical Christians viewed a particular Christian masculine gender role as the only defense of America against the threat of communism. When this threat ended upon the close of the Cold War, evangelical leaders transferred the perceived source of threat from foreign communism to domestic changes in gender roles and sexuality. You see this in American society. Just recently, a poll came out that most American conservatives trust Putin more than liberal Americans, and one of the things they cited was that Putin is, adheres to Christian values. He's homophobic, so things like that. So the rhetoric of conservative culture warriors, i.e. the Christian Coalition, Lynn Cheney, Newt Gingrich, Rush Limbaugh, helped Republicans gain control of Congress in 1994, and that Republican Revolution we talked about. From 2001 to 14, the culture wars change again, take on a new dynamic. A political view called Neoconservatism shifted the terms of the debate in the early 2000s. Neoconservatives differed from their opponents in that they interpreted problems facing the nation as moral issues rather than economic or political issues. For example, neoconservatives saw the decline of the traditional family as a spiritual crisis that required a spiritual response. So during the 2000s, voting for Republicans began to correlate heavily with traditionalists or orthodox religious beliefs across diverse religious sects. Voting for Democrats became more correlated to liberal or modernist religious belief and to being non-religious. A belief in scientific conclusions such as climate change also became tightly coupled to political party affiliation. In 2014, you see an even further broadening of the culture war. Journalist Michael Grunwald said that President Trump pioneered a new politics of perpetual culture war, enlists the Black Lives Matter movement, US national anthem protests, climate change, education policy, healthcare policy, including Obamacare and infrastructure policy as culture war issues in 2018. So this was like a major culture war wedge in 2017. Colin Kaepernick taking the knee to protest police brutality. Conservatives try to make it seem that he was like against the military, that he was like disrespecting the military by taking a knee. It's like a great example of how culture wars play themselves out. This bar owner in the Ozarks of Missouri put this as like the doormat outside of this bar. You can see this is Lynch Kaepernick. Megan Rapinoe also took a knee. There wasn't nearly as much blowback on her as there was on Kaepernick. You can draw your own conclusions as to why. So a great example of the culture wars is this Army ad that came out in 2021. Ted Cruz lost his mind over it.
This is the story of a soldier who operates your nation's Patriot missile defense systems. It begins in California with a little girl raised by two moms. Although I had a fairly typical childhood, took ballet, played violin, I also marched for equality. I like to think I've been defending freedom from an early age. When I was 6 years old, one of my moms had an accident that left her paralyzed. Doctors said she might never walk again. But she tapped into my family's pride to get back on her feet, eventually standing at the altar to marry my other mom. With such powerful role models, I finished high school at the top of my class, and then attended UC Davis, where I joined a sorority full of other strong women. But as graduation approached, I began feeling like I'd been handed so much in life, a sorority girl stereotype. Sure, I'd spent my life around inspiring women, but what had I really achieved on my own? One of my sorority sisters was studying abroad in Italy. Another was climbing Mount Everest. I needed my own adventures, my own challenge. And after meeting with an army recruiter, I found it. A way to prove my inner strength and maybe shatter some stereotypes along the way. I'm U.S. Army Corporal Emma Malone Lord, and I answered my calling.
All right, so Ted Cruz, as you can imagine, lost his mind over this. He compared like a Russian ad where it's just these like hyper masculine, like really buff dudes doing push-ups in front of jets and shit like that. And he says perhaps a woke emasculated military is not the best idea. So again, like you can see how the culture wars play themselves out in popular culture. So some of the battlegrounds in this culture war and sort of the moment we're living in is abortion. The liberals think women have a right to her body and personhood versus conservatives who think it's killing the baby. Homosexuality, particularly gay marriage, LGBT rights in particular. Multiculturalism, liberals who think diversity is what's great about the US versus conservative ideologues who view changing demographics as an affront to traditional American values and political norms. Race and civil rights, of course, is central to the culture wars. See this manifest in Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter. More restrictions on voting in recent years. Separation of church and state is another battleground. Liberals want to keep a separation between church and state. Conservatives believe the U.S. was founded as a Christian nation and doesn't make sense to separate church and state. The Russian invasion has become a recent flashpoint in the culture wars. Liberals backing Ukraine versus conservatives, such as Tucker Carlson, who have shown support for Putin or just outright ambivalence. Climate change is another example of the culture wars. Liberals follow the science versus conservatives, distrustful of science and experts in general. Oil companies are heavily invested in lobbying conservatives, including centrist Democrats such as Manchin and Sinema. Fundamentalist Christians believe that God gave man dominion over the earth and its resources, including oil, which is spelled out in the book of Genesis, not the oil part. And or the world needs to end to bring Jesus back, as prophesied in the book of Revelation. You have gun politics as another battleground. Liberals want to regulate who can get assault rifles versus conservatives who think that the right to buy any gun they want whenever they want is protected by the Second Amendment. You saw in Texas a couple years ago this funny flashpoint, the culture wars that came out. So the Texas state legislature ruled that you could take guns onto Texas campuses like the University of Texas. So this oppositional group in Texas sort of like had this hashtag cops not clocks, and they started bringing dildos to campus to sort of confront the people bringing their guns to campus. So owning the libs is obviously central to the culture war as well. So conservative media figures employing the strategy, prominently Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson, emphasize and expand upon culture war issues with the goal of goading liberal people. Owning the libs has become a substitute for the cohesive conservative ideology that existed during the Cold War era. Owning the libs holds a conservative voting bloc together in the absence of shared policy preferences among the bloc's members. Robert Reich says there's actually 6 political parties. We're running short on time, so I won't show it to you, but I'll show you this Fiore political ad that I think is a good example of how culture wars are essential to conservative politics.
I'm Michelle Fiore, and I'm running for governor. I spent my whole life fighting the establishment. I was the first female majority leader in Nevada Assembly and one of the first electeds to endorse Donald J. Trump. And you better believe I was attacked for it. Washington Post called me a gun-toting calendar girl, and Politico magazine said that I was the Lady Trump, and I don't care. We need outsiders, fighters, not the same old boring, moderate, compromise, blue blazer politicians. Let's start with a 3-shot plan. Ban vaccine mandates, ban critical race theory, and stop voter fraud. The Joe Biden administration is coming after me. I'm Michelle Fiore, and I'm ready for the fight.
Yeah, it's not a charity. So obviously the 2020 election became central to the cultural wars as well. The notion that the election was stolen versus, the fact that it wasn't. CRT is obviously central to these culture wars. I'll show you this Daily Show, which makes fun of sort of the moral panic around critical race theory.
After saving with customized car insurance from Liberty Mutual, I customize everything, like Marco's backpack.
The battle over critical race theory in classrooms raging across the country. Two arrests, two parents on the front lines of this fight. We are an army of moms and parents that will not stop until we're heard. This is a big deal. This is very deeply webbed into the culture of America.
As the culture war continued to tear the United States asunder, forces opposed to critical race theory mustered on their local school boards to declare that no American should be denied their God-given freedom to censor ideas they don't like. They were the last line of defense against facts piercing the barricades of their children's minds. Loved ones back home received heartbreaking letters from the battlefield.
My dearest Karen, indications are very strong that I shall end up banned from yet one more public building, due not to my own actions, but rather to the authorities having noticed my actions and taken objection to them. Darling, I have run afoul of the woke police, who in this case are the actual police. My crime, nothing more than speaking the fullness of my patriotic heart and also trespassing. Please send to me my Blue Lives Matter flag so that these officers may see that I am on their side, and failing that I may hit them with the pole.
The battle would rage on, claiming the time and attention of thousands of victims, until their televisions told them to be angry about another thing they had never heard of before.
So just definitionally, a lot of people don't really know what critical race theory is. It's the notion that many institutions are built on and enforce systemic racism and oppression of people of color. But this racism and oppression have a long history in the US and the world, including slavery and colonialism and their legacies, and that they are ongoing and driven by white supremacy. So the theories become a target of criticism, particularly among conservative politicians and pundits who claim that CRT is divisive and used to further many of the policies and values that conservatives oppose. But a good example of how a critical race theory is what it seeks to address is the crack versus powder. So a comprehensive examination of 100 to 1 crack versus powder cocaine sentencing disparity, under which distribution of just 5 grams of crack carries a minimum 5-year federal prison sentence, while distribution of 500 grams of powdered cocaine, which is considered to be a drug popular amongst richer, whiter people, has the same 5-year mandatory sentence. So 5 grams compared to 500 grams. So this is the notion that racism is baked into the legal system. The judge need not be racist to enforce a racist interpretation of the law. Racism is baked into the interpretation of the law. Mandatory minimum sentences mean that even non-racist judges are compelled to enforce racism embedded in American laws. And even those who are not racist may benefit from the entrenched racism in American institutions and consumer culture, most notably real estate values within federal redlining during the post-war era. So you can see just the disparity, how much more African-American males are incarcerated per 1,000 compared to white men. This one as well. So 1 in 9 white men compared to 1 in 3 African-American men. So the two views essentially, when it boils down to layman's terms, are that CRT perspective is that racism is baked into American institutions such as the justice system and law enforcement, which has a long history rooted in enforcing slave codes, enforcing Jim Crow, suburbanization/urban decline, redlining/greenlining of cities and suburbs throughout the 20th century, versus the non-people who don't believe that CRT should be a thing. They are essentially admitting that African Americans are simply more lazy and thus more inclined to be unemployed, less inclined to be employed, and more inclined to commit crime than white people, which explains why Black men are incarcerated at much higher rates. And so she should ask herself at some point in the future which side of the debate fall on. So Nike, I'll show you just one quick ad how they've sort of tried to capitalize on this critical race theory ethos in Americans.
Is this the land history promised? Here, within these lines, on this concrete court, this patch of turf. Here, you're defined by your actions, not your looks or beliefs.
should have no boundaries. The bonds we find here should run past these lines.
It's been a long time coming.
Opportunity should not discriminate. The ball should bounce the same for everyone.
Change gonna come.
Worth should outshine color. If we can be equals here, we can be equals everywhere.
Touching, it almost makes you forget that Nike uses slave labor to make their shoes, which Enes Kanter of the Celtics has tried to point out through designing his shoes, things like made with slave labor. LeBron James, when he's asked about it, he just says like, oh, I'm researching, I'm acquiring facts. So this is like meant to sort of be a shot at LeBron, but having no stance on it essentially. All right, so we'll talk about attention merchants, the last 3 bits on Thursday. See you guys.
No, I'll drive over. I'll drive over.
Hi, professors. See you guys. You got a presentation, Anna?
Oh, yeah.
Good luck.
Thank you.